2 weeks before everything went to hell, I found the first photograph wedged between the storm door and the main door of our farmhouse in rural Oregon. It was a Polaroid picture of me in my kitchen taken through the window while I was washing dishes, the timestamp showing it was from 3 nights earlier. I was 31, recently divorced, trying to rebuild my life with my 8-year-old daughter Sophie in the old farmhouse I had inherited from my grandmother. The property sat on 12 acres of Douglas fir and oak, isolated enough that our nearest neighbor was almost a mile down the gravel road. I should have called the police immediately, but I convinced myself it was some kind of prank. Maybe one of the teenagers from town had driven out here on a dare. The divorce had been messy, and I wondered if my ex-husband was trying to intimidate me somehow, though photography was never his style. I showed the picture to my sister when she came to visit that weekend, and she insisted I report it. But when Deputy Martinez came by Monday afternoon, he seemed more concerned about my mental state than any potential threat. "Ma'am, you've been under a lot of stress with the divorce and moving out here," he said, turning the Polaroid over in his hands. "Could be someone just passing through thought it was funny. I'll increase patrols in the area, but unless something else happens, there's not much we can do." Something else did happen. 3 nights later, I woke up around 2 in the morning to Sophie shaking me. She was standing next to my bed in her pink unicorn pajamas, her face pale in the moonlight streaming through the curtains. "Mama, there's a man outside my window," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was looking at me while I was sleeping." My blood turned to ice. Sophie's bedroom was on the 2nd floor. To look in her window, someone would need a ladder or would have to climb the old oak tree whose branches reached toward that side of the house. I grabbed the baseball bat I had started keeping beside my bed and told Sophie to stay behind me as we crept down the hallway. Her room faced the back of the property, toward the woods that stretched for miles in every direction. I peered through her window, my heart hammering against my ribs. The motion sensor light I had installed the week before illuminated the backyard in harsh white light, but I could see nothing unusual. The tree branches swayed gently in the October wind, casting moving shadows across the grass. I checked the window lock twice, then moved to the other upstairs windows looking for any sign of disturbance. Everything appeared normal. "Maybe it was just a dream, sweetheart," I told Sophie, though I did not believe it myself. She was a practical child, not given to nightmares or wild imagination. "It wasn't a dream, Mama." He had a camera. The flash woke me up, and when I opened my eyes, he was taking pictures of me sleeping. That detail made my stomach clench, with fear and disgust. I called 911 immediately, but by the time the deputy arrived 45 minutes later, there was nothing to see. He walked the perimeter of the house with his flashlight, checked the ground beneath Sophie's window for footprints, but the dry autumn leaves revealed nothing conclusive. "I'm going to recommend you install a security system," Deputy Martinez said before leaving, "and maybe consider staying with family for a few days while we investigate." But I had spent every dollar I had on attorney fees during the divorce. A security system was not in my budget, and I refused to be driven from my home by some pervert with a camera. I moved Sophie into my bedroom that night, pushing her twin bed against the wall next to mine. We would sleep together until I figured out what to do. The photographs continued appearing. One showed me walking to my car in the morning, coffee mug in hand, taken from somewhere in the tree line. Another captured me folding laundry in the living room, shot through the front window. Each one was dated and time-stamped, creating a chronological record of my daily routine. Someone was watching us, learning our patterns, documenting our lives with methodical precision. I started varying my schedule, leaving for work at different times, taking different routes home. I bought thick curtains for every window and kept them drawn even during the day. The house felt like a cave, but at least whoever was out there could not see inside anymore. Sophie stopped playing in the backyard, and I could see the stress affecting her. She was jumpy, had trouble sleeping, and her teacher called to express concern about her distraction in class. 2 weeks after the first photograph appeared, I found something that made me physically sick. Taped to the inside of my mailbox was a manila envelope containing dozens of Polaroids. Pictures of me getting dressed in my bedroom, taken from a position that would have required someone to be in the old oak tree outside my window. Images of Sophie playing in her room, completely unaware she was being watched. Photos of us sleeping, the camera flash somehow not waking either of us. But the most disturbing images were of the inside of our house, taken when we were not home. Someone had been inside, photographing our personal belongings, our family pictures, even the contents of our refrigerator. In one image, they had arranged some of Sophie's toys in a disturbing tableau on her bedroom floor. In another, they had moved items around in my dresser drawer, creating patterns that I had not noticed when I got dressed that morning. The timestamps on these interior photographs spanned several weeks. This person had been coming into our home repeatedly, moving through our spaces while we slept or while we were away. They had been watching us, studying us, documenting every aspect of our lives for reasons I could not comprehend. I called the police again, but Deputy Martinez was off duty. The officer who came to take the report seemed more competent, Detective Sarah Chen from the County Sheriff's Department. She examined each photograph carefully, noting the timestamps and angles. "This person has been stalking you for at least a month," she said. "The fact that they have interior photographs means they have been inside your home. We need to process this as a breaking and entering case, possibly burglary, and definitely stalking." She arranged for a forensics team to dust for fingerprints, though she warned me that most stalkers are careful enough to wear gloves. They found evidence of tampering with the lock on the back door, scratches on the metal that suggested someone had picked it. Detective Chen recommended I change all the locks immediately and consider installing a security system, even a basic one. That night, Sophie and I stayed at my sister's house in town. While we were gone, Detective Chen positioned surveillance equipment around the property. Hidden cameras with night vision capability, motion sensors linked directly to the sheriff's department, and an officer parked in an unmarked car at the end of our driveway. The trap worked faster than anyone expected. Around midnight, the motion sensors triggered and the cameras captured clear footage of a man approaching the house. He was wearing dark clothing and a ski mask, carrying a camera and what appeared to be a lockpick set. When he reached the back door and began working on the lock, 3 deputies emerged from their hiding positions and surrounded him. The man they arrested was someone I had never seen before, a drifter named Curtis Dalton, who had been camping in the national forest land adjacent to our property. He had been living in a makeshift shelter about 2 miles into the woods, surviving by stealing from isolated farmhouses and cabins in the area. Our house had become his obsession because, as he told detectives during questioning, he liked watching families, particularly mothers and daughters. In his camp, they found hundreds more photographs, not just of Sophie and me, but of other families throughout the county. He had detailed notebooks documenting the daily routines of his subjects, maps showing the layouts of various homes, and disturbing writings that revealed his increasing fantasies about the people he stalked. Detective Chen later told me that I was lucky we caught him when we did, because his writing suggested he was escalating toward more direct contact. Curtis Dalton had been living beneath our property for almost 3 months, entering our home at least twice a week whenever we were asleep or away. He knew Sophie's school schedule, my work routine, even when my sister visited. He had been planning something more invasive, Detective Chen explained, though she would not give me the specific details of what they found in his notebooks. The most disturbing revelation came during his psychological evaluation. Dalton told the court, psychiatrist, that he had done this before, in Washington State and Northern California, always targeting isolated rural homes with single mothers and children. He would study a family for months, document their lives obsessively, then disappear and move on to the next target. We were just the latest in a pattern that had been going on for years. Sophie and I moved back to town after that. I could not live in that house anymore, knowing that someone had been watching us sleep, moving through our rooms while we were unconscious, studying us like specimens in a laboratory. We found a small apartment above a bakery on Main Street, where the sounds of traffic and other people felt comforting instead of intrusive. Curtis Dalton pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including stalking, breaking and entering, and possession of child pornography. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but Detective Chen warned me that people like him rarely reform. When he gets out, he will likely start over somewhere else, finding new families to terrorize with his camera and his twisted need to invade their privacy. Even now, 2 years later, I check every window lock twice before bed and keep curtains drawn at all times. Sophie still sleeps in my room some nights, especially when she has nightmares about the man with the camera. We both flinch when we hear unexpected sounds at night, and I find myself constantly scanning crowds and parking lots, looking for anyone who might be watching us too closely. The worst part is knowing that for months, our most private moments were not private at all. Someone was always watching, always documenting, always there in the shadows with his camera and his notebooks. That sense of violation never completely goes away. The knowledge that our safety was an illusion, and our home was never really ours at all. My name is Mia, and I was 23 when I agreed to house sit for Professor Whitmore during his sabbatical in England. The Victorian house in Salem, Massachusetts had been in his family for generations, a 3-story monument to New England Gothic architecture with bay windows, ornate woodwork, and the kind of creaking floors that announced your presence to every room in the house. As a graduate student in art history, I was grateful for the opportunity to live rent-free in exchange for basic maintenance and keeping an eye on his extensive collection of rare books and artifacts. Professor Whitmore had been my advisor for 2 years, a distinguished man in his 70s who specialized in colonial American religious art. His house reflected his academic interests, filled with Puritan-era furniture, religious paintings from the 17th century, and glass cases containing artifacts from Salem's witch trial period. He assured me the house was perfectly safe, though he mentioned that previous house sitters had sometimes reported odd sounds at night, which he attributed to the building's age and the New England weather. I moved in on a gray October afternoon as the last leaves were falling from the ancient oak trees that surrounded the property. The house felt immediately oppressive, not because of any supernatural atmosphere, but simply because of its size and the weight of history contained within its walls. Every room was filled with dark, heavy furniture and oil paintings of stern-faced colonists who seemed to watch me as I walked past. The first week passed without incident. I established a routine of studying in the library during the day, preparing simple meals in the kitchen that had been modernized but retained its period character, and spending evenings reading in the sitting room beside the original fireplace. The isolation was peaceful after the chaos of graduate school, and I was making excellent progress on my thesis about religious symbolism in early American art. The shadows started moving during my second week in the house. At first, I attributed the phenomenon to the changing angle of sunlight through the tall windows as autumn progressed. The house had dozens of windows, many with irregular glass that had been in place for over a century, and the way light filtered through them created complex patterns on the walls and floors throughout the day. But these shadows were different. They moved independently of any light source, sliding along the walls like dark stains spreading across fabric. I first noticed them in my peripheral vision while reading in the library, dark shapes that seemed to detach themselves from corners and glide across the room before disappearing behind furniture or into doorways. When I turned to look directly at them, they were never there, but I could feel their presence, a sensation like being watched by something that remained just outside the range of vision. The temperature in whatever room I occupied would drop several degrees, and I found myself constantly reaching for sweaters and closing windows that I had not remembered opening. Professor Whitmore had left detailed instructions for maintaining the house, including a list of quirks and maintenance issues that had developed over the decades. He mentioned that some of the interior doors had a tendency to swing open on their own due to settling in the foundation, and that the third floor sometimes produced sounds like footsteps when the wind was strong. I tried to rationalize the shadow movements as similar phenomena, tricks of an old house that I would learn to ignore with time. But the shadows grew bolder during my third week. They began appearing during daylight hours, darker and more substantial than before, moving with purpose rather than the random drifting I had initially observed. They seemed to be learning the layout of the house, following the same paths repeatedly, as if tracing routes between rooms for reasons I could not understand. One afternoon, while organizing Professor Whitmore's papers in his study, I watched a shadow detach itself from the bookshelf behind his desk and move directly toward me. It was roughly human-shaped but without distinct features, a patch of absolute darkness that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. When it reached the edge of my desk, it stopped, and I felt a presence hovering just beyond my shoulder, as if something was reading over my arm. I sat perfectly still, afraid that any sudden movement might provoke whatever was manifesting in the room with me. After several minutes, the shadow retreated, sliding backward along the same path until it merged with the darkness behind the bookshelf and disappeared. My hands were shaking so badly that I could not continue working, and I spent the rest of the afternoon in the kitchen with all the lights on, trying to convince myself that stress and isolation were causing hallucinations. That night, I called my roommate from graduate school, desperate for normal human conversation and some perspective on what I was experiencing. Sarah listened patiently as I described the moving shadows, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice as she suggested I was working too hard and spending too much time alone in an old house that was probably full of mice and settling sounds. But as we talked, I watched a shadow move across the kitchen wall behind me, visible in the reflection of the window above the sink. It paused when it reached the edge of the window frame, and I had the distinct impression that it was listening to my conversation. When Sarah asked if I was still there, I realized I had stopped talking mid-sentence, transfixed by the sight of something that should not exist, eavesdropping on my phone call. The shadows became more aggressive during my fourth week in the house. Instead of simply moving through rooms, they began interacting with objects, though never when I was looking directly at them. I would hear books falling in the library, and when I investigated, I would find volumes scattered on the floor beneath empty spaces on the shelves. Papers on Professor Whitmore's desk would be rearranged into neat piles overnight, organized by some system I could not determine. Most disturbing were the changes to the religious artifacts throughout the house. Crucifixes would be found turned upside down, prayer books open to specific passages that dealt with spiritual warfare and demonic possession, and the glass cases containing Puritan-era religious items would be found with their locks undone and contents rearranged. Whatever presence inhabited the house was demonstrating knowledge of religious symbolism, and seemed to be making deliberate theological statements through its manipulations. I began researching the history of the house and the Whitmore family, hoping to find some explanation for what I was experiencing. The house had been built in 1692, the same year as the Salem witch trials, by a Puritan minister named Ezra Whitmore, who had been instrumental in the prosecution of accused witches. Several women had been interrogated in the house before their trials, and at least 3 had died in the basement while awaiting transportation to the courthouse. Professor Whitmore was a direct descendant of Ezra Whitmore, and the house had remained in the family for over 3 centuries. Previous generations had reported similar phenomena, particularly during times when the house was occupied by single individuals rather than families. The shadows seemed to manifest most strongly when the house contained only one living person, as if they fed on isolation and solitude. During my 5th week, the shadows began appearing in my dreams. I would find myself walking through the house at night, following dark figures that led me through rooms I had never seen before, down hallways that did not exist in the actual layout of the building. In these dreams, the shadows had voices, whispering in languages I could not understand but somehow knew were accusations and condemnations. I began waking up in different parts of the house from where I had gone to sleep, sometimes finding myself standing in the library or the basement with no memory of how I had gotten there. The sleepwalking episodes left me exhausted and disoriented, and I started setting alarms throughout the night to prevent myself from wandering unconsciously through the building. The climax came during a thunderstorm in early November. I was reading in the sitting room when the power failed, leaving me in complete darkness except for the occasional flash of lightning through the windows. As my eyes adjusted, I realized the darkness was not empty. Shadows moved throughout the room, dozens of them, more than I had ever seen before, all converging toward my chair. They surrounded me in a circle, and in the intermittent lightning I could see that they had developed more distinct shapes. They resembled human figures in colonial dress, men and women in the dark clothing of Puritan New England, but their faces were voids of absolute blackness that seemed to pull light out of the air around them. One of them spoke, its voice like wind through dry leaves, accusing me of trespassing on sacred ground, of disturbing the peace of those who had died unjustly within these walls. The others joined in, their voices creating a chorus of condemnation that filled the room with words I could understand despite their archaic language and accusatory tone. They told me they were the spirits of women who had been tortured and killed in the house, innocent victims of Ezra Whitmore's religious fanaticism, who had never found peace after their deaths. They had been trapped in the building for centuries, their anger growing stronger with each generation of Whitmores who profited from the legacy of their persecution. The shadows reached toward me, and I felt cold fingers touching my skin, pulling at my clothes, trying to drag me into their circle. I screamed and ran from the room, crashing through the hallway in complete darkness, falling up the stairs and locking myself in the bedroom I had been using on the 2nd floor. I called Professor Whitmore in England despite the time difference and the expense of the international call. When I described what was happening, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he admitted that the house had a history of supernatural activity that he had not mentioned because previous house sitters had always left before experiencing anything significant. He arranged for me to stay in a hotel for the remainder of his sabbatical and hired a professional house-sitting service to maintain the property. When I returned to collect my belongings the next day, accompanied by 2 friends from graduate school, we found that every religious artifact in the house had been destroyed. Crucifixes had been snapped in half, prayer books had been torn to pieces, and the glass cases had been shattered from the inside. The shadows were gone, as if their destruction of the religious items had finally allowed them to find the peace they had been seeking for 3 centuries. But the house felt different, emptier, like a building whose purpose had finally been fulfilled. I never completed my thesis on religious symbolism in colonial American art. The experience in Professor Whitmore's house had given me a perspective on the intersection of religion and supernatural phenomena that I was not prepared to explore academically. I changed my focus to modern art and avoided any subject matter that dealt with historical religious persecution. Professor Whitmore sold the house when he returned from England and donated his artifact collection to the Peabody Essex Museum. He never explained his decision to liquidate a family legacy that had been maintained for over 3 centuries, but I suspect he finally understood that some historical injustices create debts that can never be fully repaid. Sometimes I wonder if the shadows found peace after their final act of destruction, or if they simply moved on to haunt other places connected to their persecution. The Salem area has many buildings with similar histories, and I have heard stories from other graduate students about supernatural encounters in colonial-era houses throughout New England. But I stay away from old houses now, particularly those with connections to the witch trials or other episodes of religious persecution. Some historical research requires a level of personal risk that extends far beyond academic curiosity, and I learned that some stories are better left undisturbed. The cabin belonged to my grandfather, tucked away in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, where the nearest road turned to dirt 20 miles back and cell phone service died somewhere around mile 15. My name is Brian, and I had invited 3 friends to join me for what was supposed to be a long weekend of hunting and drinking, far from jobs and responsibilities and the endless noise of modern life. The cabin had been in my family for 40 years, and I had been making these trips since college without incident. Marcus, Trevor, and Kyle arrived Friday afternoon just as the October sky began to dim with the promise of an early winter. The cabin was small but comfortable, with a wood-burning stove, propane appliances, and enough space for 4 grown men who did not mind sleeping in bunk beds like teenagers at summer camp. We had brought enough food and beer for a week, though we only planned to stay until Monday morning. The first night passed without incident. We stayed up late playing cards, drinking whiskey, and sharing stories about failed relationships and workplace frustrations. The isolation felt therapeutic after months of urban stress, and when we finally went to bed around 2 in the morning, the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the occasional call of an owl somewhere in the darkness beyond our windows. Saturday morning, we split up to hunt. Marcus and Trevor headed north toward the creek that ran through the valley, while Kyle and I took the southern ridge where my grandfather had always claimed the deer were more plentiful. We agreed to meet back at the cabin by sunset, a rule my grandfather had drilled into me from childhood. The mountains could be unforgiving to anyone caught out after dark, especially when the weather turned. Kyle and I returned first around 5:30, empty-handed but satisfied with a day in the woods. We started a fire and began preparing dinner, expecting Marcus and Trevor to arrive within the hour. When 6:30 came and went without sign of them, we began to worry. By 7:30, with full darkness settling over the mountains and the temperature dropping toward freezing, Kyle suggested we take flashlights and head out to look for them. We had been searching for maybe 20 minutes when we heard Marcus calling from somewhere to the east of the cabin. His voice carried clearly through the thin mountain air, calling our names and asking for help. Kyle and I exchanged glances and immediately headed in that direction, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness between the trees. "Marcus, where are you?" I called back, my voice echoing off the surrounding peaks. "Over here by the big pine," came his response, though the direction seemed wrong. The voice was coming from deeper in the woods, farther from where Marcus and Trevor should have been hunting. We pushed through the undergrowth, branches catching at our jackets, following the sound of Marcus's voice. But something felt wrong. The voice was calling from different directions, first to our left, then ahead of us, then behind us, as if Marcus was moving rapidly through the forest in patterns that made no sense. "Marcus, stay where you are," Kyle shouted. "We are coming to you." "Stop moving around," the voice called back, agreeing to stay put, but within minutes we heard it again from a completely different location. This continued for almost an hour, with us stumbling through the darkness, following a voice that seemed to be leading us in circles, always just out of reach. Kyle was the first to voice what we were both thinking. "That does not sound exactly like Marcus," he said, stopping to catch his breath against a boulder. "The words are right, but something about the voice is off." I had been thinking the same thing, though I could not articulate what was wrong. The voice had Marcus's tone and inflection, but there was something artificial about it, like a recording being played back rather than actual speech. And there was the matter of how quickly it moved from place to place, covering ground that would have been impossible for a person on foot. We decided to return to the cabin and wait. If Marcus and Trevor were lost, they knew the area well enough to follow the creek back to familiar landmarks. If they were injured, we would organize a proper search party in the morning with help from the Forest Service. Stumbling around in the dark was not helping anyone. Back at the cabin, we built up the fire and waited. Around 10 o'clock, we heard Trevor's voice calling from the direction of the front door. Kyle immediately went to let him in, but when he opened the door, no one was there. The porch was empty, our motion sensor light illuminating nothing but falling leaves and the beginning of snow flurries. "Trevor!" Kyle called into the darkness. "I am here," came Trevor's voice, but it was coming from behind the cabin now near the woodshed. Kyle grabbed his flashlight and circled the building but found nothing. For the next 3 hours, we were subjected to a methodical psychological assault. The voices of our missing friends called to us from every direction, sometimes pleading for help, sometimes engaging in normal conversation as if nothing was wrong. The voices knew details that only Marcus and Trevor would know, referencing shared memories and using inside jokes that should have been impossible for anyone else to duplicate. Around 1 in the morning, both voices began calling simultaneously from opposite sides of the cabin. Marcus's voice from the north side, Trevor's from the south, both asking us to come outside and help them with something. The conversations overlapped and intertwined, creating an impossible dialogue between two people who claimed to be in different locations. Kyle had barricaded the door with a chair and was sitting with his hunting rifle across his knees. I kept moving between windows, trying to catch sight of whatever was out there. But the darkness beyond our lights revealed nothing. The voices continued their calls, growing more insistent, more desperate, begging us to come outside and help them. "They are hurt," Trevor's voice pleaded. "Marcus is bleeding. I cannot carry him alone." "The thing got Trevor," Marcus's voice called from the other direction. "I think it broke his leg. I need help getting him back to the cabin." The contradictory stories should have made it obvious that something was wrong, but the voices were so convincing, so perfectly matched to our friends, that part of me wondered if they were both injured and confused, calling out in delirium without understanding what they were saying. Around 3 in the morning, the voices changed tactics. Instead of pleading for help, they began engaging us in normal conversation, as if they were sitting around the campfire with us. Marcus's voice told the story about the time he got arrested in college for streaking through the library during finals week. Trevor's voice described his recent breakup with his girlfriend, using the exact words he had used when he told us about it the previous evening. The conversations felt so natural that Kyle actually responded a few times before catching himself. It was Marcus's voice telling a funny story about his new job, and Kyle laughed and made a comment as if we were all sitting together in the same room. The normalization of the situation was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire experience. As dawn approached, the voices began to fade. The last thing we heard was both voices saying goodbye, thanking us for a great weekend and promising to see us soon. Then silence fell over the mountains, broken only by the wind and the crackling of our dying fire. Kyle and I sat in stunned silence as gray morning light filtered through the windows. We had not slept, had barely eaten, and neither of us was entirely sure what we had experienced during the night. In the daylight, the whole thing seemed impossible, like a shared hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. Around 8 in the morning, we heard a vehicle approaching the cabin. Looking out the window, I saw Marcus's truck coming up the dirt road, bouncing over the ruts and rocks that marked the final approach to the cabin. Both Marcus and Trevor were visible in the front seat, apparently unharmed. They climbed out of the truck looking tired but normal, carrying their hunting gear and talking about the deer they had seen but failed to get a clean shot at. When Kyle and I rushed outside to greet them, they looked at us with confusion and concern. "You guys look terrible," Marcus said. "Did you get any sleep last night?" When we explained what had happened, describing the voices calling to us throughout the night, both men insisted they had been miles away. They had made camp near the creek, they said, and had spent the night around their own fire, sharing a bottle of bourbon and talking about old times. They had heard nothing unusual and had certainly not called out to us or approached the cabin during the night. Trevor showed us photographs on his phone, time-stamped images of their campsite and the fire they had built. The metadata confirmed they had been taken throughout the previous evening and night, miles from the cabin. There was no way they could have been the source of the voices Kyle and I had heard, but the voices had known things that only Marcus and Trevor could know. Personal details, shared experiences, private jokes that had never been written down or recorded anywhere. Whatever had been calling to us during the night had somehow accessed information that should have been impossible to obtain. We packed up and left that morning, cutting our trip short by a day. None of us talked much during the drive back to civilization, and we have never returned to the cabin together since that weekend. Marcus and Trevor seemed to accept our story, but I could tell they thought Kyle and I had experienced some kind of shared psychotic episode brought on by isolation and stress. Kyle and I have discussed that night many times over the years since, trying to make sense of what we experienced. We have considered every rational explanation, from psychological stress to environmental factors to elaborate pranks orchestrated by strangers. None of the explanations fit the facts as we experienced them. The voices were too perfect, too accurate in their mimicry. They knew details that no outsider could have known, and they sustained complex conversations for hours without making any mistakes in character or tone. Whatever intelligence was behind those voices had somehow acquired intimate knowledge of our relationships and personal histories. I sold the cabin 2 years later. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now seemed threatening, and I could not shake the feeling that something was still out there in those woods, watching and waiting and learning to imitate the voices of anyone who might venture too far from safety. The official explanation, if anyone bothered to investigate, would probably involve altitude sickness, stress hallucinations, or some other psychological phenomenon that affects people in extreme isolation. But Kyle and I know what we heard that night, and we know it was not human. Sometimes I wonder if Marcus and Trevor remember that weekend differently than they claim. Sometimes I catch them looking at Kyle and me with expressions I cannot quite read, as if they are trying to decide whether we can be trusted with some secret they carry. But then the moment passes, and they are just our friends again. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. The mountains keep their secrets, and whatever called to us that night using the voices of our friends remains out there in the wilderness, patient and intelligent and utterly inhuman. My name is Eric, and I moved to Dallas, Texas in September 2019 for a software engineering position at a tech startup downtown. After years of cramped apartments and unreliable roommates, I was finally earning enough to afford my own place. I found a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood called Meadowbrook, complete with a front porch, a small backyard, and neighbors who seemed normal from the brief interactions I had during my house hunting visits. The neighborhood felt like something from a 1950s television show, with neat lawns, white picket fences, and the kind of tree-lined streets where children rode bicycles and parents walked dogs at predictable times. After the chaos of urban apartment living, the suburbanite routine felt comforting and safe. The first month passed without incident. I established a work-from-home routine in the spare bedroom I had converted into an office, ordered furniture online, and began the slow process of turning an empty house into something that felt like home. My neighbors were polite but distant, offering waves from their driveways and occasional comments about the weather when we encountered each other while collecting mail or taking out trash. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who lived directly across the street, was the exception. She made a point of introducing herself during my first week and brought me a casserole along with a detailed explanation of the neighborhood dynamics. She mentioned the Johnsons on the corner who traveled frequently for work, the young couple next door who had recently married and kept late hours, and various other details about local residents that I politely acknowledged but did not particularly need to know. It was Mrs. Patterson who first mentioned the smiling man during our third conversation, which took place while I was attempting to repair my sprinkler system on a Saturday morning in October. "You should be careful about that fellow who has been asking about you," she said, approaching my front yard with a concerned expression and a coffee mug in her hands. I stopped wrestling with the sprinkler head and looked up at her. "What fellow?" "Tall man, maybe 40 years old, always wearing a nice suit even during the day. He has been walking through the neighborhood for the past week asking questions about the new resident. That would be you, I suppose." She described a man who claimed to be conducting a survey for the city planning department, asking detailed questions about my schedule, my work habits, whether I lived alone, and what kind of security system I might have installed. He carried a clipboard and wore an official-looking badge which had convinced several neighbors to provide information they probably should not have shared with a stranger. "The thing that bothered me was his smile," Mrs. Patterson continued. "It never changed, no matter what anyone said to him. Just this wide, fixed smile that did not reach his eyes made me uncomfortable, so I told him I did not have time for surveys." I thanked her for the warning, but did not think much of it initially. Door-to-door salespeople and survey takers were common enough, and I assumed this man was legitimate but perhaps overly persistent in his approach. I made a mental note to be polite but brief if he approached me directly. The man appeared at my front door the following Tuesday evening while I was eating dinner. Through the peephole, I could see exactly what Mrs. Patterson had described: a tall man in an expensive-looking dark suit holding a clipboard, wearing an identification badge, and displaying a smile so wide and rigid that it looked painful to maintain. When I opened the door, his smile somehow became even broader, revealing teeth that were unnaturally white and perfectly straight, like something from a dental advertisement. "Good evening," he said, his voice pleasant but somehow artificial, like a recording of someone trying to sound friendly. "My name is David Crawford, and I am conducting a neighborhood satisfaction survey for the Dallas City Planning Department. I understand you are the new resident at this address." His questions were innocuous enough initially. How long had I lived in the house? Was I satisfied with city services? Did I feel safe in the neighborhood? But gradually the inquiries became more personal and specific. What time did I typically leave for work? Did I work from home often? Had I installed any security cameras or alarm systems? Throughout the conversation, which lasted perhaps 15 minutes, his smile never wavered. Not when I mentioned I worked in software engineering, not when I declined to provide specifics about my schedule, not even when I politely indicated that I needed to return to my dinner. The smile remained fixed, unnatural, and increasingly disturbing as I realized it did not correspond to anything happening in our conversation. When I finally closed the door, I watched through the window as he walked to the sidewalk. Instead of proceeding to the next house, he stood at the end of my driveway for several minutes, looking back at my house with that same unwavering smile before finally disappearing around the corner. The next morning, I called the Dallas City Planning Department to verify David Crawford's credentials. After being transferred between several departments, I spoke with a supervisor who confirmed that the city was not conducting any neighborhood satisfaction surveys in my area. There was no employee named David Crawford in their system, and they advised me to report any suspicious individuals claiming to represent the city to the local police. I filed a report with the non-emergency line, providing the physical description Mrs. Patterson and I had developed. The officer who took my information said they had received similar reports from other neighborhoods throughout the past month. Someone was impersonating a city employee to gather information about residents, though his ultimate purpose remained unclear. Over the following weeks, I began noticing signs that someone was observing my house and monitoring my routine. My newspaper would be moved from where the delivery person typically placed it. Items in my mailbox would be slightly rearranged, as if someone had examined my mail before replacing it. Most disturbing, I found footprints in the flower bed beneath my bedroom window, fresh impressions in the soft soil that appeared overnight and matched the size and pattern of dress shoes. I installed security cameras around the perimeter of my property, positioning them to cover all approaches to the house as well as the front and back doors. The system included night vision capability and motion-activated recording, with alerts sent directly to my phone whenever movement was detected. The cameras captured him within 3 days. David Crawford, still wearing his dark suit and maintaining that horrifying smile, appeared in my backyard at 2:47 in the morning. He walked slowly around the house, peering into windows, testing door handles, and at one point standing directly beneath my bedroom window for nearly 20 minutes, looking up at the glass with his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Most disturbing was his behavior when he noticed the cameras. Instead of fleeing or attempting to avoid detection, he walked directly up to each camera, stood close enough that his face filled the frame, and smiled even more broadly while staring directly into the lens. He remained motionless for several minutes at each camera location, as if posing for photographs before moving to the next one. I called the police immediately, but by the time officers arrived, David Crawford had vanished. The responding officers reviewed the camera footage and agreed that his behavior was highly suspicious and potentially dangerous. They increased patrols in my neighborhood and advised me to document any further incidents. The harassment escalated dramatically the following week. I began receiving phone calls at all hours, sometimes 15 or 20 per night, from numbers that showed up as unavailable or blocked. When I answered, I would hear silence for several seconds, followed by what sounded like quiet laughter before the line went dead. More disturbing were the packages that began appearing on my porch. Small boxes wrapped in brown paper containing items that should not have been available to anyone outside my home. Photographs of my kitchen taken from inside the house, a photocopy of a personal letter I had written but not yet mailed, a small piece of fabric that I recognized as coming from a shirt in my laundry hamper. Each package included a handwritten note in precise, careful handwriting. The messages were variations on the same theme: expressions of admiration for my lifestyle, comments about how happy I appeared to be, and suggestions that happiness was something that could be shared or collected or transferred from one person to another. The final note was different. Instead of the usual observations about my happiness, it contained a detailed schedule of my activities for the previous week. When I had left the house, where I had gone, how long I had been away, even what I had eaten for dinner on specific nights. Someone had been watching me constantly, documenting every aspect of my routine with obsessive precision. The climax came on a Thursday night in November when my motion sensors triggered at 3:15 in the morning. Instead of checking the camera app on my phone, I got up to look out my bedroom window directly. David Crawford was standing in my backyard, still wearing his suit, still maintaining that terrible smile. But this time he was holding something in his hands. As I watched, he began taking photographs of my house with a professional-looking camera, using a flash that illuminated the entire yard in harsh white light. But he was not photographing the building itself. He was taking pictures of the windows, specifically the windows behind which I was standing, as if he could see me watching him. After several minutes of photography, he walked to my back door and began working on the lock with what appeared to be professional lock-picking tools. I called 911 immediately and retreated to my bedroom, locking the door and grabbing a baseball bat from my closet. The police arrived within 6 minutes, but David Crawford was gone by then. However, this time he had left behind evidence. The lock-picking tools were scattered on my back porch along with the camera and dozens of printed photographs. The images showed not just my house, but the houses of at least a dozen other people throughout the Dallas area, all taken from inside their properties during what appeared to be nighttime break-ins. Detective Maria Santos, who took over the case, explained that David Crawford was part of a pattern they had been tracking for months. Someone was systematically targeting suburban homeowners, gathering detailed personal information, then breaking into their homes to photograph their private lives. The photographs seemed to be trophies rather than preparation for theft, as nothing of monetary value had been stolen from any of the victim locations. The investigation revealed that David Crawford was not his real name. Fingerprints from the lock-picking tools matched a man named Robert Hayes, who had been arrested in California for similar behavior but had failed to appear for his court date and disappeared. He had been targeting what he called happy people in suburban neighborhoods, people whose lives appeared successful and content from external observation. Detective Santos explained that Robert Hayes had a history of mental illness involving obsessions with other people's emotional states. He believed that happiness was a finite resource that could be stolen or absorbed through close observation and documentation. Break-ins and photography were part of an elaborate ritual designed to capture and collect the happiness he perceived in his victims. Robert Hayes was arrested 2 weeks later during an attempted break-in at another house across town. The homeowner had been warned about the pattern and was prepared with additional security measures. Hayes was charged with multiple counts of breaking and entering, stalking, and identity theft. I moved out of the Meadowbrook house before his trial concluded. Even with Hayes in custody, I could not shake the feeling that someone was still watching, still documenting, still smiling that terrible artificial smile while observing my private moments. The security cameras had provided protection, but they also revealed how vulnerable I had been without realizing it. The new apartment I found has multiple locks, a doorman, and neighbors close enough that privacy comes with the comfort of nearby human presence. But sometimes late at night I find myself checking windows and locks repeatedly, listening for sounds that might indicate someone is trying to get inside to photograph whatever happiness they think they can steal from my life. My name is Charlotte, and I was 25 when I moved into the apartment on the 8th floor of the Canyon Vista complex in Phoenix, Arizona. After finishing my master's degree in environmental science, I had accepted a research position with a nonprofit organization focused on desert conservation. The apartment was small but affordable, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an impressive view of the surrounding mountains and enough space for me to live comfortably while saving money to pay off student loans. The complex was relatively new, built in the early 2000s with modern amenities and what the rental office proudly described as an advanced ventilation system designed to handle the extreme Arizona heat. Each unit was connected to a network of air ducts that circulated cool air throughout the building, with centralized controls that maintained comfortable temperatures even during the brutal summer months when outside temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees. I moved in during September when the weather was just beginning to cool from the oppressive heat of summer. The apartment felt like a sanctuary after months of job searching and the stress of graduate school, and I looked forward to establishing a routine that would allow me to focus on my new career and personal goals. The first indication that something was wrong came during my second week in the apartment. I woke up around 3 in the morning to a scratching sound coming from somewhere above my bedroom ceiling. It was rhythmic and deliberate, like claws scraping against metal, and it seemed to move from one corner of the room to another before fading into silence. I assumed it was mice or some other small animal that had gotten into the ventilation system, a common problem in desert climates where creatures seek shelter from extreme temperatures. I made a mental note to contact the building management in the morning, but was not particularly concerned about what seemed like a minor maintenance issue. The scratching sounds continued for several nights, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always following the same pattern of movement across my ceiling before disappearing. During the day, I tried to trace the sounds to their source, examining the ventilation grates in my apartment and listening for any unusual noises coming from the ductwork. The building maintenance supervisor, a friendly man named Carlos who had worked at Canyon Vista since its construction, came to investigate after I submitted a work order. He checked all the ventilation grates in my apartment, inspected the ductwork accessible from my unit, and found no signs of animal intrusion. Sometimes the metal expands and contracts when the temperature changes, he explained while securing a loose grate in my bedroom. That can create sounds that seem like scratching or movement, especially at night when everything is quiet. But the sounds I was hearing were not random creaks or settling noises. They were purposeful, consistent, and seemed to respond to my presence in the apartment. When I moved from the bedroom to the living room during nighttime episodes, the scratching would pause for several minutes before resuming in the area above wherever I had relocated. 3 weeks after moving in, I discovered the first piece of evidence that something was actually moving through the ventilation system. While cleaning my bathroom, I noticed that the ventilation grate above my shower had been damaged. Several of the metal slats were bent outward, creating an opening large enough for something to pass through, and there were scratch marks on the surrounding ceiling tiles that had not been there when I moved in. More disturbing was what I found on the bathroom floor, a piece of what appeared to be shed skin, translucent and flexible, roughly the size of my hand. It was unlike anything I had seen before, with a texture that was neither reptilian nor mammalian, but something entirely different. When I touched it, the material felt dry but somehow organic, like the molted exoskeleton of an insect, but much larger and thicker. I collected the skin sample in a plastic bag and took photographs of the damaged ventilation grate, then contacted both building management and the local animal control office. The animal control officer who responded to my call examined the evidence but was unable to identify the species that might have produced the shed skin. "It is not from any animal I am familiar with," he admitted while studying the sample under a magnifying glass. "The size suggests something fairly large, but the texture does not match any known reptile or mammal species native to this area. You might want to consider having an exterminator examine your apartment." The professional exterminator I hired found additional evidence of intrusion throughout the ventilation system. Several grates in the building had been damaged in ways consistent with something forcing entry from inside the ductwork, and there were scratch marks on metal surfaces throughout the network of air ducts that connected all the apartments in the complex. Most significantly, he discovered a pattern to the damage that suggested whatever was in the ventilation system was not randomly moving through the ducts, but was systematically exploring the building, testing access points, and learning the layout of individual apartments. "Whatever is doing this is intelligent," he explained while showing me photographs he had taken inside the ductwork with a specialized camera. "It is not just wandering around looking for food or shelter. It is mapping the building, learning where people live, studying their routines." The scratching sounds in my apartment became more frequent and more aggressive during my 4th week in the complex. Instead of brief episodes lasting a few minutes, the movements continued for hours at a time, accompanied by what sounded like something large, repositioning itself within the narrow confines of the ductwork. More disturbing were the changes in my apartment that began occurring during the day while I was at work. Items would be moved or rearranged in ways that suggested someone or something had been examining my personal belongings. Books would be pulled from shelves and left open to specific pages. Clothing would be removed from drawers and arranged in neat piles on my bed. Food items in my kitchen would be opened and partially consumed, but in patterns that did not suggest normal animal feeding behavior. The intruder seemed particularly interested in anything that might contain information about my schedule or personal habits. My work calendar would be moved from my desk to different locations in the apartment, always open to the current week. Personal letters and documents would be removed from filing systems and left in prominent locations as if they had been carefully read and studied. I began staying elsewhere, sleeping on a friend's couch while trying to determine my options for dealing with whatever was systematically invading my living space. But even when I was not in the apartment, the activity continued and intensified. Building security cameras captured unexplained movements in the hallways during nighttime hours, and other residents began reporting similar problems with damaged ventilation grates and missing personal items. The crisis reached its climax on a Friday evening in October when I returned to my apartment to collect additional clothing and found that whatever had been living in the ventilation system had finally emerged into my living space. The evidence was unmistakable. Furniture had been moved to create clear pathways from the ventilation grates to various locations throughout the apartment, and there were wet tracks across my floors that suggested something large and possibly amphibious had been exploring my home. Most terrifying was the discovery that my bedroom had been transformed into what could only be described as a nest. My bedding had been arranged in a circular pattern around the room, mixed with additional pieces of shed skin and what appeared to be organic material brought in from outside the building. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of musk and decay that made it difficult to breathe. As I stood in my bedroom doorway trying to process what I was seeing, I heard movement from above my head. Looking up, I saw that the ventilation grate had been completely removed, creating a dark opening into the ductwork. Something was moving inside the duct, something large enough to block most of the opening, and I could hear what sounded like labored breathing or perhaps some form of vocalization I could not identify. I backed toward my apartment door, but before I could leave, something began emerging from the ventilation opening. What I saw defied any logical explanation or comparison to known animal species. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but moved with the fluid, boneless motion of something more akin to an octopus or large snake. The skin was translucent and moist, revealing internal structures that pulsed with movement, and it had multiple limbs that seemed to function both as arms and legs depending on the terrain it was navigating. Most disturbing were what appeared to be sensory organs positioned where a face might be on a human form. Clusters of dark spots that tracked my movement across the room with obvious intelligence and purpose. When it fully emerged from the ductwork and began moving toward me, I could see that it was much larger than the ventilation opening should have been able to accommodate, as if it could alter its physical dimensions to fit through spaces that were too small for its normal size. I ran from the apartment and called 911 from the hallway, but by the time police and emergency responders arrived, the creature had disappeared back into the ventilation system. The evidence of its presence remained: the damaged bedroom, the nesting materials, the shed skin samples, and the wet tracks throughout my apartment. The building was evacuated while specialists attempted to locate and remove whatever had been living in the ventilation system, but they found nothing. The ductwork was thoroughly cleaned and inspected, damaged grates were replaced, and the entire system was sealed with screens designed to prevent animal intrusion. But no trace of the creature itself was ever discovered. I moved out immediately and never returned to Canyon Vista. The building management offered to relocate me to a different unit, but I could not overcome the knowledge that something intelligent and potentially dangerous had been studying my life, learning my routines and preparing for some form of direct contact that I was not willing to risk experiencing. The official explanation provided by wildlife experts who examined the shed skin samples was that an unknown species of large reptile or amphibian had somehow gotten into the building's ventilation system, possibly through construction gaps or damaged exterior screens. They theorized that the creature had been using the ductwork for shelter and had become confused or territorial when it encountered human activity. But their explanation did not account for the intelligence I had observed in the creature's behavior, the systematic way it had explored the building and studied the residents, or the deliberate modifications it had made to my living space. Whatever I encountered in that apartment was not simply an animal seeking shelter, but something with cognitive abilities and purposes that extended far beyond basic survival instincts. I still avoid apartments with central air conditioning and extensive ventilation systems. The idea that something unknown might be moving through hidden passages above my head, watching and learning and planning, creates a level of anxiety that makes sleep almost impossible. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, listening for scratching sounds that might indicate something has found me again, something that remembers my scent and habits from our brief encounter in Phoenix. My name is Jacob, and I was 28 when my wife Emma and I bought our first house in a gated community called Sunset Gardens in Clearwater, Florida. Emma had just given birth to our daughter Lily, and we were eager to establish ourselves in a safe, family-friendly neighborhood where we could raise our child without the concerns that come with urban living. The community was everything the real estate agent had promised. Well-maintained homes with manicured lawns, a private park with a playground, and neighbors who took pride in their properties and looked out for one another. Most of the residents were young families like ourselves or retirees who had moved to Florida for the weather and peaceful lifestyle. Our house was a 3-bedroom ranch with a small backyard and a 2-car garage, perfect for our growing family. Emma planned to stay home with Lily for the first year, while I worked night shifts as a security supervisor at Tampa International Airport. The schedule was challenging, but the pay was good enough to afford our mortgage and give Emma time to bond with our daughter during those crucial early months. Our next-door neighbor introduced himself the day we moved in. Richard Hoffman was probably in his early 40s, divorced, and worked from home as some kind of financial consultant. He was immediately helpful, offering to loan us tools, giving us recommendations for local services, and sharing information about homeowners association rules and neighborhood traditions. Richard had lived in Sunset Gardens for about 3 years, and he seemed to know everyone in the community. He was the type of neighbor you want in a crisis, knowledgeable, reliable, and always available to help with whatever problem might arise. Emma appreciated having someone nearby who could assist her during the day when I was sleeping after my overnight shifts. The first month in our new home was exactly what we had hoped for when we decided to move to the suburbs. Emma established a routine with Lily that allowed both of them to thrive, and I felt confident leaving for work each evening knowing they were safe in a neighborhood where people looked out for one another. Richard was particularly attentive, often checking in with Emma to make sure she had everything she needed. Emma mentioned how helpful Richard had become during our second month in the house. He would appear at just the right moments when she was struggling with groceries or when Lily was having a particularly difficult day. He seemed to have an uncanny ability to anticipate when Emma might need assistance, always showing up with offers to help that were exactly what she required. "He is almost like he has been watching us," Emma said one evening while I was getting ready for work. "Not in a creepy way, just really attentive to our schedule and what we might need help with." Yesterday, he knocked on the door right when Lily started crying, and he had this baby formula that he said he had, bought by mistake when he was shopping for his nephew. I was grateful to have such a considerate neighbor, especially given the demands of my work schedule. Night shifts meant I slept during the day when Emma was alone with Lily, and knowing that Richard was nearby provided peace of mind that allowed me to rest without constantly worrying about their safety. But Richard's helpfulness began to seem excessive during our third month in the neighborhood. Emma mentioned that he was stopping by almost daily, always with some reason that seemed plausible but felt increasingly unnecessary. He would bring mail that had been delivered to his address by mistake, offer to take out our trash if he noticed we had forgotten, or knock on the door to inform us about neighborhood association meetings or maintenance schedules. More concerning was Richard's detailed knowledge of our daily routine. He knew exactly when I left for work and when I returned in the morning. He was aware of Emma's schedule with Lily, including when she typically went for walks, when she did laundry, and when she usually prepared meals. His conversations were filled with references to activities he should not have been able to observe from his own property. He mentioned that Lily woke up crying around 3 in the morning last Tuesday, Emma told me during our 4th month in the house. But there is no way he could have heard her from his house, and I did not tell him about it. It makes me wonder if he is somehow listening to what happens inside our house. I decided to pay more attention to Richard's behavior and started documenting the timing of his visits and the information he seemed to possess about our family life. What I discovered was disturbing. Richard's interactions with Emma followed patterns that suggested he was monitoring our activities far more closely than any normal neighbor would. He would appear within minutes of my departure for work, as if he had been watching for my car to leave the driveway. His offers of help were always perfectly timed to Emma's needs, suggesting he was aware of her struggles before she had mentioned them to anyone. Most concerning, his casual comments about our activities included details that could only have been obtained through direct observation of our private moments. During my 5th month of night shifts, I decided to test my suspicions by varying my schedule without informing anyone in the neighborhood. Instead of leaving for work at my usual time, I would park my car around the corner and return to the house through the backyard, positioning myself where I could observe Richard's behavior without being seen. The results confirmed my worst fears. Within 20 minutes of my apparent departure, Richard would emerge from his house and position himself where he could observe our front door and windows. He would spend hours in his backyard or garage, always maintaining a clear line of sight to our house, occasionally using what appeared to be binoculars or a telescope to get a closer look at our windows. More disturbing was what I observed when Emma took Lily for walks around the neighborhood. Richard would follow at a distance, ducking behind trees or parked cars, maintaining visual contact while staying far enough away that Emma would not notice his presence. He was not simply being protective, he was conducting systematic surveillance of my wife and daughter. I confronted Richard directly after documenting several weeks of this behavior. I approached him in his driveway one evening before leaving for work and asked him about his unusual interest in my family's activities. His response was both defensive and revealing. "I am just being neighborly," he insisted, but his eyes would not meet mine. "Emma is alone during the day with a new baby, and I want to make sure she is safe. There have been break-ins in other neighborhoods, and I think it is important for neighbors to look out for each other." When I mentioned specific instances of his surveillance behavior, Richard became agitated and claimed I was being paranoid and ungrateful. He accused me of being an irresponsible husband and father for working night shifts and leaving my family unprotected. His anger seemed disproportionate to our conversation, and I realized that Richard's interest in my family was more personal and possessive than I had initially understood. The situation escalated dramatically the following week when I returned home early from work due to a power outage at the airport. Instead of entering through the front door, I came through the backyard and was shocked to discover Richard inside my house. He was sitting in my living room holding Lily and feeding her a bottle, while Emma was nowhere to be seen. Richard was wearing my clothes, my favorite sweater, my jeans, even my house slippers. He had positioned himself in my chair, surrounded by my belongings, and was caring for my daughter as if she were his own. When he saw me standing in the doorway, he did not show surprise or guilt, but rather annoyance that I had interrupted what he clearly considered a normal activity. "You are home early?" he said, continuing to feed Lily as if nothing unusual was happening. Emma was tired, so I told her to take a nap while I watched the baby. Lily and I were just getting to know each other better. I demanded to know where Emma was and how he had gotten into my house. Richard explained that Emma had given him a spare key weeks ago so he could help with emergencies, and that she had asked him to babysit while she rested. When I found Emma, she was unconscious in our bedroom, and I could not wake her despite my attempts. I called 911 immediately, and paramedics determined that Emma had been drugged with a powerful sedative that had been dissolved in her coffee. While she was treated at the hospital, police searched Richard's house and found evidence of extensive surveillance equipment, including cameras that had been positioned to monitor our home's interior, recording devices that had captured our private conversations, and detailed logs documenting our daily activities going back months. Most disturbing was Richard's collection of personal items he had stolen from our house. Emma's clothing, my work uniforms, photographs of our family, and even some of Lily's toys and blankets. He had created what could only be described as a shrine in his bedroom, with our belongings arranged around photographs of himself holding Lily and wearing my clothes. The police investigation revealed that Richard had been planning what he called family integration for several months. His goal was to gradually replace me in Emma's life by positioning himself as the more reliable and available father figure, eventually convincing her that she would be better off with him than with a husband who worked night shifts and was frequently absent from home. Richard's plan involved drugging Emma during my work hours and caring for Lily himself, creating a false sense of dependency and gratitude that he hoped would develop into romantic feelings. He had been documenting these sessions with hidden cameras, creating a record of himself functioning as Lily's primary caregiver that he planned to use as evidence of his superior parenting abilities. The investigation also uncovered similar patterns of behavior at Richard's previous residences in 2 other states. He had been arrested twice for stalking young mothers and had been forced to relocate each time after restraining orders were issued against him. His move to Florida had been motivated by the need to escape his history and find new targets who were unaware of his previous crimes. Richard was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including breaking and entering, drugging Emma, child endangerment, and stalking. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, but the psychological damage to our family was far more lasting than his legal punishment. Emma struggled with anxiety and depression for months after the incident, unable to trust her own judgment about people's intentions and constantly worried that someone else might be watching our family. She required therapy to process the violation of having someone monitor our most private moments and manipulate her into accepting help that was actually part of a predatory plan. We moved out of Sunset Gardens within 6 months, relocating to a different state where we could start over without the constant reminders of Richard's intrusion into our lives. Emma still has difficulty accepting help from neighbors, and I changed today's shift work so I could be home with my family during evening hours when they feel most vulnerable. The experience taught us that the appearance of safety in gated communities can be deceptive, and that the neighbors who seem most helpful and attentive may have motivations that extend far beyond normal community concern. Richard's ability to present himself as the perfect neighbor while systematically planning to destroy our family demonstrates how predatory behavior can be disguised as kindness and consideration. Sometimes I wonder how many other families Richard had targeted before focusing on ours, and whether his pattern of behavior will continue after he is released from prison. The knowledge that someone can study your life so carefully and infiltrate your daily routine so completely creates a lasting sense of vulnerability that makes it difficult to trust anyone who shows unusual interest in your family's well-being. My name is Amelia, and I was 24 when I rented the studio space on the 3rd floor of the converted church in Beacon, New York. After finishing my MFA in painting, I needed an affordable place to work on my art while I applied for gallery representation and teaching positions. The building had been renovated into artist studios and apartments, but the rent was surprisingly cheap for the Hudson Valley area, which should have been my first warning that something was wrong. The Church of Sacred Heart had been abandoned for nearly 15 years before developers bought it and converted the interior into live workspaces for artists. The Gothic architecture remained intact, with soaring ceilings, stained glass windows, and stone walls that had witnessed over a century of religious services. My studio occupied what had once been the choir loft, with tall windows that provided excellent natural light and enough space for large canvases. The building housed about 12 artists in various disciplines, from sculptors to musicians to writers, all drawn by the cheap rent and the romantic idea of creating art in a sacred space. Most of my neighbors were friendly but kept to themselves, focused on their work and struggling to make ends meet like artists everywhere. The building manager, an elderly man named Frank who lived in the converted rectory, was helpful but seemed uncomfortable discussing the building's history. During my first month in the studio, I attributed the strange acoustics to the church's original design. Voices from other parts of the building would carry through the stone walls and wooden floors in unexpected ways, creating an almost constant background murmur of conversation and activity. The Gothic architecture amplified and distorted sounds, making it difficult to determine where voices were coming from or whether they were coming from current residents or from outside the building. But gradually I began to notice that some of the voices I was hearing did not match the artists I knew lived in the building. Late at night, when the studios should have been empty, I would hear what sounded like a large group of people singing in harmony, their voices echoing through the stone walls with the resonance of a full choir. The singing was beautiful but unsettling, particularly because it often occurred at 3 or 4 in the morning when I was working alone. The songs were hymns I recognized from my childhood, traditional Christian melodies that would have been appropriate for the building's original purpose. But the voices singing them had an otherworldly quality, as if they were coming from very far away or from people who were not entirely present in the physical space. When I mentioned the late-night singing to my neighbors, none of them reported hearing anything unusual. During my second month in the studio, the voices began to change in tone and content. Instead of ethereal hymn singing, I started hearing what sounded like heated arguments and heated discussions coming from somewhere below my studio space. The voices were clearer now, and I could make out individual words and phrases, though the conversations themselves made little sense out of context. The speakers seemed to be debating matters of theology and morality with passionate intensity, using language that sounded archaic and formal, like something from colonial New England rather than contemporary New York. They argued about sin and redemption, about the proper way to worship, about the corruption of modern society and the need to return to traditional values. Most disturbing was when the voices began to acknowledge my presence in the building. I would hear my name mentioned in their conversations, always in tones of disapproval and concern. They discussed my art, which they apparently could observe somehow, expressing horror at what they called blasphemous images and desecration of sacred space. My paintings were abstract expressionist works that explored themes of spirituality and transcendence, but from a contemporary rather than traditional Christian perspective. I incorporated imagery from various religious traditions and philosophical systems, creating visual dialogues between different approaches to understanding the divine. To me, the work was respectful and spiritually genuine, but the voices in the walls seemed to view it as an attack on their beliefs. The criticism became more specific and more aggressive during my third month in the studio. The voices would comment on individual paintings while I was working on them, offering detailed critiques that demonstrated intimate knowledge of my artistic process and intentions. They seemed particularly upset by a series I was developing that incorporated imagery from pre-Christian religious traditions alongside Christian symbolism. "The girl paints idols and calls it art," one voice would say, clearly audible despite my inability to determine its source. "She brings pagan corruption into the house of the Lord," another would respond. "Something must be done to stop this desecration before it spreads to the other inhabitants." The conversations would continue for hours, with multiple voices joining the discussion, all expressing variations on the same theme. My presence in the building was inappropriate. My art was offensive to their sensibilities, and action needed to be taken to remove me from what they considered their sacred space. I researched the building's history and discovered that the Church of Sacred Heart had been the center of a significant theological controversy during the 1970s. The congregation had split over questions of modernization and social justice, with conservative members accusing the progressive faction of abandoning traditional Christian values. The conflict had become so bitter that the church ultimately closed rather than continue operating with a divided congregation. Several former parishioners had died during the final years of the controversy, including the elderly organist who had led the choir for over 50 years and 2 deacons who had been particularly vocal in their opposition to the church's liberal direction. The building had remained empty for decades, with several attempts at renovation failing due to unexplained problems and accidents that drove away contractors and potential buyers. During my 4th month in the studio, the voices began to manifest in ways that went beyond simple auditory phenomena. I would arrive at my studio to find my paintings rearranged or turned to face the wall, as if someone was trying to prevent them from being displayed. Paint tubes would be opened and their contents spilled across my work surfaces, always in patterns that suggested deliberate vandalism rather than accidental damage. Most disturbing was when I discovered that someone had been altering my paintings during the night. Fine details would be changed in ways that modified the meaning of the images, often adding traditional Christian symbols or removing elements that incorporated non-Christian imagery. The changes were executed with skill and artistic understanding, suggesting that whoever was making them had significant knowledge of painting techniques. When I installed security cameras in my studio to document these incidents, the footage revealed nothing unusual during the times when the vandalism occurred. The cameras would record normally throughout the night, showing my empty studio with no signs of intrusion. But in the morning, I would find new damage that had somehow occurred without being captured on video. The crisis reached its climax during a winter storm in February when the power failed throughout the building. I had been working late by candlelight when the voices began speaking directly to me rather than discussing me in the third person. They called my name repeatedly, commanding me to stop painting and leave the building immediately. When I refused to respond, the voices became more aggressive and threatening. They began chanting in Latin, using phrases I recognized as exorcism prayers, treating me as if I were a demonic presence that needed to be driven from sacred ground. The chanting grew louder and more insistent, echoing through the stone walls with increasing intensity. As the chanting reached a crescendo, I felt a presence enter my studio. The temperature dropped dramatically, and I could see my breath in the candlelight. Something invisible began moving through my workspace, knocking over paint containers, tearing canvases, and destroying months of work with systematic thoroughness. I tried to flee, but found that I could not move my body according to my conscious will. Something was controlling my actions, forcing me to pick up matches and begin setting fire to my remaining paintings. I watched in horror as my hands, moving without my direction, systematically destroyed everything I had created during my time in the building. The fire spread quickly, threatening to engulf the entire studio and potentially the whole building. Only the arrival of the fire department, summoned by neighbors who saw smoke, prevented a complete disaster. When the firefighters found me, I was standing in the center of the burning studio, apparently unharmed but completely unresponsive to their attempts to communicate with me. I spent 3 days in the hospital being treated for smoke inhalation and what doctors described as a dissociative episode brought on by stress and isolation. When I was released, I discovered that my studio had been completely destroyed, along with all my artwork and supplies. The building management offered to relocate me to a different studio, but I declined and moved out immediately. The investigation into the fire concluded that it had been caused by unattended candles, a finding I did not dispute despite knowing that the candles had not been the true source of the flames. The insurance settlement covered my financial losses but could not compensate for the psychological trauma of having my body controlled by an external force. I moved back to the city and eventually returned to painting, but I avoid religious imagery entirely now and refuse to work in any building with a sacred history. The experience in the converted church convinced me that some places retain the spiritual energy of their original purpose in ways that can be hostile to activities they perceive as inappropriate or disrespectful. Other artists who lived in the building after my departure reported similar experiences with voices, vandalism, and inexplicable incidents. The building was sold again within 2 years and converted into luxury condominiums, with all traces of its religious architecture removed during the renovation. I sometimes wonder if eliminating the physical reminders of the building's sacred past also eliminated the spiritual presences that had made it uninhabitable for artists. The voices I heard in that building were not hallucinations or psychological symptoms, but the genuine spiritual presence of people who had been so devoted to their religious beliefs that death had not ended their commitment to protecting what they considered sacred space. Their opposition to my art was not personal malice, but sincere religious conviction that transcended the normal boundaries between the living and the dead. I still dream about that night when something else controlled my actions, forcing me to destroy my own work in service of beliefs I did not share. The memory of watching my hands move without my conscious direction serves as a constant reminder that human consciousness is more fragile than we like to believe, and that some places contain forces powerful enough to override our most basic sense of autonomy and self-control. My name is Ethan, and I was 29 when I moved into the 32nd floor apartment in the Millennium Tower on North Michigan Avenue in Chicago. As a cybersecurity analyst for a financial services company, I could finally afford to live in the type of high-tech, high-security building that matched my professional expertise. The apartment featured smart home automation, multiple security systems, and panoramic views of Lake Michigan that made the premium rent seem worthwhile. I had specifically chosen this building because of its advanced security measures. Keycard access at every level, security cameras in all common areas, and a 24-hour concierge service that monitored everyone entering and leaving the building. After years of living in apartments with minimal security, the Millennium Tower felt like a fortress where I could finally relax and feel completely safe. My apartment was a one-bedroom unit with floor-to-ceiling windows, stainless steel appliances, and integrated technology that allowed me to control lighting, temperature, and security systems through my smartphone or voice commands. I installed additional security cameras inside my unit, connected to a professional monitoring system that would alert me instantly if anyone entered while I was away. The building attracted young professionals like myself, people who worked in technology, finance, and consulting, all drawn by the combination of luxury amenities and cutting-edge security features. Most residents kept to themselves, focused on demanding careers that required long hours and constant connectivity to work systems and clients. During my first month in the apartment, I began to notice small inconsistencies in my daily routine that suggested someone was accessing my living space. Items would be moved slightly from where I had left them, always in ways that were subtle enough that I might have attributed the changes to my own forgetfulness if I had not been trained to notice such details. My work in cybersecurity had made me naturally paranoid about unauthorized access, and I documented every anomaly I observed. Books moved from one shelf to another, kitchen items rearranged in drawers, clothing repositioned in my closet in ways that created more organized configurations than I typically maintained. The changes were always improvements rather than damage, as if someone was tidying my apartment according to standards that were more meticulous than my own. Whoever was entering my space was not stealing anything or creating disorder, but was instead organizing my belongings in ways that revealed intimate knowledge of my personal habits and preferences. More disturbing was evidence that someone was using my computer and accessing my personal files. I would find documents open that I had not accessed recently, browser histories that included websites I had not visited, and email messages that had been marked as read when I was certain I had not opened them. Professional paranoia kicked into overdrive, and I installed additional monitoring software on all my devices, including keyloggers and access logs that would record every interaction with my systems. The data I collected was deeply unsettling. Someone was using my computer regularly, always during hours when I was at work, accessing my files with the same level of technical skill that I possessed. The intruder knew my passwords, understood my file organization systems, and navigated my computer with the familiarity of someone who had been studying my digital habits for months. They read my emails, reviewed my financial records, examined my work documents, and browsed my personal files with systematic thoroughness. Most disturbing was evidence that they were using my access credentials to monitor my workplace systems from my home computer. My employer's security protocols required multi-factor authentication that should have prevented anyone else from accessing company networks using my login information. But somehow this person was bypassing those safeguards. I began varying my schedule and installing physical security measures throughout my apartment, including motion sensors, door alarms, and cameras positioned to monitor every possible entry point. The building's security system should have prevented unauthorized access, but I wanted redundant protection that would catch anyone who might have found ways to circumvent the primary defenses. The monitoring equipment revealed the shocking truth: no one was entering my apartment from outside. The security footage showed my apartment remaining locked and undisturbed during the times when I knew my belongings were being moved, and my computer was being accessed. Whoever was doing this was already inside my apartment and had been there the entire time. I reviewed months of security footage, looking for any evidence of an intruder, but found nothing that explained how someone could be living in my space without being detected. My apartment was not large enough to hide a person, and I had examined every closet, cabinet, and potential hiding place multiple times. The answer came during a power outage that shut down the building's electrical systems for several hours one evening in November. Without the constant hum of air conditioning, elevators, and electronic devices, my apartment was silent enough that I could hear sounds I had never noticed before. Breathing that was not my own, coming from somewhere inside my walls. Following the sound, I discovered that the advanced ventilation system that was one of the building's luxury features had been modified. The ducts were large enough for a person to move through them, and someone had created a hidden living space within the building's mechanical systems, complete with power taps and network connections that allowed them to monitor and control the smart home systems of multiple apartments. The person living in my walls was not a random intruder, but someone with extensive technical knowledge who had been systematically infiltrating the building's most technologically advanced units. They had been accessing the apartments of residents who worked in technology and finance, studying their digital habits and using their computers and network access for purposes I could not immediately determine. When I confronted the building management with evidence of this elaborate intrusion, They initially dismissed my concerns as paranoia. But when I provided detailed documentation of the unauthorized network access and the modifications to the ventilation system, they agreed to investigate. The building's security team working with law enforcement discovered that the intruder was Marcus Webb, a former contractor who had worked on the building's original construction and had maintained access through systems he had installed but never properly documented. He had been living within the building's infrastructure for over 2 years, moving between apartments through the ventilation system and using residents' technology and internet access to run an identity theft and financial fraud operation. Marcus had chosen victims based on their professional backgrounds, targeting people with high-level access to corporate systems that he could exploit for financial gain. He had been using my work credentials to access my employer's client databases, stealing financial information that he then sold to criminal organizations that specialized in identity theft and corporate espionage. The investigation revealed that Marcus had been accessing over 20 apartments in the building, always choosing units belonging to technology professionals whose digital expertise made them valuable targets for his operation. He had created detailed profiles of each resident, documenting their schedules, passwords, and personal habits with the same systematic approach I used in my own security work. Most disturbing was the discovery that Marcus had been recording everything that happened in the apartments he infiltrated, including private conversations, personal activities, and confidential business communications. He had accumulated thousands of hours of footage and audio recordings that he used both for blackmail purposes and to gather intelligence about his victims' professional and personal vulnerabilities. The legal consequences extended far beyond simple breaking and entering. Marcus was charged with multiple felonies including identity theft, corporate espionage, computer fraud, and invasion of privacy. My employer launched an internal investigation to determine what confidential information had been compromised through my systems, and I faced professional consequences despite being a victim rather than a willing participant in the data breach. The building implemented extensive security upgrades, including complete replacement of the ventilation system and installation of additional monitoring equipment throughout mechanical areas. But the psychological damage to residents was more difficult to address. The knowledge that someone had been living within the building's walls, watching and recording our most private moments, created a lasting sense of violation that no security upgrade could eliminate. I moved out of Millennium Tower within 3 months of Marcus's arrest. Despite the improved security measures, I could not overcome the knowledge that my home had never actually been private, that every conversation, every activity, every moment of what I had believed to be solitude had been observed and recorded by someone whose technical skills matched my own. The irony was not lost on me that my expertise in cybersecurity had been completely useless against an intruder who understood technology as well as I did. Marcus had used my own tools against me, turning the smart home systems I had trusted into surveillance equipment that allowed him to monitor every aspect of my life. I now live in an older building with minimal technology integration, preferring the inconvenience of manual systems to the vulnerability that comes with automated security. I check my apartment for hidden cameras and recording devices regularly, and I never discuss work-related matters or personal information when I am at home. The experience taught me that privacy is largely an illusion in modern urban environments, where the same technology that promises security and convenience can be exploited by people with sufficient knowledge and access. Someone with the right skills can turn any smart home into a surveillance system, any connected device into a monitoring tool, any security measure into a vulnerability that can be exploited for criminal purposes. Sometimes I wonder how many other buildings contain people like Marcus, individuals who have found ways to live within the infrastructure and exploit the technology that surrounds us. The idea that someone could be watching from inside the walls of any modern apartment building makes it impossible to feel truly secure in any space that relies on electronic systems for protection. The silent watcher in my walls was not a supernatural threat, but something far more disturbing. A human predator who used technology and intimate knowledge of modern security systems to violate the privacy of people who believed they were protected by the same systems he was exploiting. That kind of invasion feels more permanent and more threatening than any ghost story because it reveals vulnerabilities in the infrastructure we depend on for basic safety and security.